All right, so we are live now. So I think we could give it a minute just for the attendees to join. Right, so governments, private sector firms, and law enforcement agencies around the world struggle to stem the spread of illicit trade. From counterfeit goods to illicit financial flows, illegal cross-border trade of authentic products to human trafficking and drugs, the shadow economy continues to grow. While illicit trade existence is well known, the nature of the trade itself makes its size hard to determine. Estimates range from 650 billion to over 3 trillion, reflecting the difficulty in measurement. Moreover, the dangers of illicit trade extend beyond economics, posing in its various forms a real threat to economies and businesses, public health, the environment, as well as tax revenues. Illicit trade causes the loss of billions in tax revenue for governments, funds that can be channeled toward the COVID-19 economic recovery efforts. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Hazim Ibrahim, the founder and CEO of Asia Security Group, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. So today we have a combination of distinguished speakers who have joined us to share ideas, insights, and point of view on illicit trade, its impact on our society, its drivers and consequences, as well as the practices and effective strategies to combat it. Today's panelist represents organizations and companies that are very active in the fight against illicit trade. In fundamental sense, they need no introduction, so I'll be brief. So first, I'll be introducing Mr. Heath Michael, who is the Managing Director for Retail and Trade Brand Advocacy, who is specialized in delivering for retail brands and suppliers in regulatory and legislative outcomes for the last 7 years. He continued to work with retail brands in advocacy with government while also working with suppliers on specific issues, including protection of new and existing products. Heath's extensive political and advocacy experience spans over 2 decades in government and industry sectors. Thanks for joining us today, Heath.
Thank you.
All right, next I'll be introducing Rodney Van Doren, who is currently based in Hong Kong. Rodney has been with Philip Morris International for 23 years and was appointed to his current role as Director for Illicit Trade Evasion for the Asia Pacific region in August 2019. Returning to Asia after 3 years in Switzerland, where he operated as Director for Illicit Trade Prevention for Eastern Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, and for PMI's worldwide duty-free business. Rodney leads PMI's Asia region efforts for safeguarding the legitimate supply and purchase of its products, protecting the best interest of the company, shareholders, customers, and society, and takes an outcome-based approach with interest in initiatives and cooperations that directly improve the performance of PMI cigarettes and alternative nicotine delivery portfolios. Thanks for joining us today, Rodney. Next, I'll be introducing Dr. Deborah Elms, who is the Executive Director of the Asian Trade Center in Singapore. She is also President of the Advisory Board of the Asia Business Trade Association and the Board Director of the Asian Trade Center Foundation. Dr. Elms sits on the International Technical Advisory Committee of the Global Trade Professional Alliance and is the chair of the Working Group on Trade Policy and Law. She sits on Board of Trade and Investment Negotiation Advisor at the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia Pacific. Thanks for joining us today, Deborah. Lastly, I'll be introducing Tony Luck, who is the chairman of Transported Asset Protection Association in Asia Pacific, an international forum that focuses on reducing losses in supply chains through globally recognized standards, certification audits, and real-time supply chain information incident system. He sits on Emeritus Council of Advisors for Supply Chain Asia. He also has a strong background in supply chain management, security, law enforcement, general management, as well as electronic security, aviation security, telematics, and global account management. Thanks for joining us today, Tony.
Good morning. Thank you for having me on the webinar today.
Thank you. So before we deep dive into our topic today, we could firstly have a brief overview on the organization represented today. So if you could start, Heath.
Yes, thank you. We've been working with a range of brands, retail suppliers on a range of illicit issues from high-end fashion to modern slavery acts being implemented, issues around tax, excise, tariff evasion. Really, there's some key products in that sphere around alcohol, and also friends from Morris know all about issues involving tobacco. Some jurisdictions have up to 60% of their market now as illicit product. We continue to work within the region and with Australia to try and improve cooperation cross-jurisdictionally, but also within jurisdictions when it comes to enforcement regimes, and to get government to take a serious look at what is driving some of the trade in the tax space in particular. I won't continue on too much. I'll let everyone else have their piece, and we can round back through when the questions come through.
Moving to you, Rodney, if you could give us a quick overview on Philip Morris International.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the intro before, Hazam. It's really a true pleasure to be part of the conversation. The new normal, right? This whole virtual platform. I look forward to sharing both my comments and also answering some questions. But maybe just a little bit about who is PMI, or who is Philip Morris International. I'd say we're rapidly transforming as a result of our mission of what we call a smoke-free future, which is a future without cigarettes. And for this reason, among others, what we're embarking on is, I think, much more relevant than who we were. When I say who we were, look, at one point very recently, we were the largest cigarette company in the world, excluding China. According to the World Health Organization, there will still be more than about 1 billion smokers in 2025, and PMI wants to provide those billion adult smokers who choose not to quit with better options than continuing to smoke. And our commitment is the result of, I'd say, many years of careful deliberation, which is backed by a pretty substantial R&D program. From our point of view, it's time for smoke-free alternatives. The best option for everybody is to simply quit tobacco and nicotine use altogether, or even better, not even to start. But for the large population of existing adult smokers who would otherwise continue to smoke, there has to be a sensible plan. And in a world where smoking is a fact of life, we can't simply ignore the compelling scientific evidence, because scientifically substantiated, less harmful products than cigarettes are now available to adult smokers who would otherwise continue to smoke. And so we're obviously pursuing that path.
Yep. All right. So next will be Debra, if you could share a quick overview on Asian Trade Center.
Thank you very much. We sit in Singapore. We work with companies and governments on trade and trade policy. And the main point for us is to ensure that businesses have the best available operations, space for operations, and that governments achieve the kind of regulatory policies that they want.
Yep. Right. Thank you, Deborah. I think Tony, if you could give us a quick overview.
Yeah, certainly. So look, I'm Tony. I'm the chairman of TAPA. So as Hasim said, we design and put together standards for the supply chain to improve the resilience and sustainability of the supply chain. And if you go to the next slide, please. I just want to quickly point out some of the things that we have in place which would actually help and address some of these issues, particularly the truck security requirement and also the guarding security requirement. There are two good tools actually to use. And look, we send out broadcast alerts as well as collect the data on different crime trends. Obviously, we have partnership groups across the whole region where we work together in collaboration to obviously help out. And look, we also have news events, and we send out a supply chain resilience newsletter, twice weekly. So those are some of the brief elements that TAPA provides.
Yep. All right. Thanks, Tony. I think today's webinar, our agenda is quite simple. So we are basically in the middle of the panel discussion. We will have a Q&A session in the end of the discussion. So if you are watching this online, you can drop your comments in the live comments, and it will pop up to our screen, and we will answer it once we reach to the Q&A session. So I think to deep dive into the topic, I think Debra, from your background in trade policy and law, if you could define to us what is illicit trade actually.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I think one of the challenges with tackling illicit trade is defining what is illicit trade. And the challenge there is that everyone's definition is slightly different. So illicit trade could be counterfeit or fake products. It could be financial flows that are illegal. It could be trade in endangered species. It could be trade in fishery products that are unregulated and illicit. It could be copyright or IP infringement, or areas where intellectual property right and ideas are being stolen. So there's a whole lot of different ways to define what is illicit trade. And I think that the challenge then is which portion of illicit trade are we discussing? And then how do we form, because we're particularly interested in policy outcomes, how do you create a policy framework that tackles either all of those elements of illicit trade, or does a good job at focusing on particular aspects of illicit trade, eventually adding up, sort of in a building block way, to depressing, or, I mean, the hope would be eliminating all forms of illicit trade. I don't know if it's possible to eliminate all illicit trade, because the incentives are often very high to engage in illicit trade for customers, for firms, etc., but at least dampen the amount of illicit trade, because, as we'll talk about throughout this webinar, it harms society, it harms firms, it has the potential to be deadly, depending on what we're talking about. It has the potential to cause economic damage. And so it's important to think about how do we address it, and making sure, as we address illicit trade, that we are not also blocking legitimate legal trade avenues. So it's a delicate balance here, I think, for governments in particular, in trying to tackle the challenges around illicit trade while not strangling legal and licit trade. So let me just stop there and let my colleagues comment on that.
Yep. Thank you. So I think, Tony, if you could share with us from your perspective, how can actually illicit trade harm our society, especially harm the consumer?
Well, certainly our members are reporting to us various issues. So, for instance, in the pharmaceutical sector, we have a lot of fake drugs actually being smuggled through at the moment, especially with all the confusion that's going on with COVID. So the counterfeiters are actually taking advantage of the current situation and really are pushing through these fake drugs. We've also seen the fake PPE equipment being sent through, and look, I think a lot of countries have been the victims of that. Again, look, it goes back to a number of areas that we can talk about later in this webinar. I think the overall, if you look at our electronic, if you look at, for instance, the tobacco industry, and I'm sure Rodney will explain more of that later, all of them have the same problem that Deborah has alluded to in terms of fake products. But of course, where those fake products then go into the supply chain, into aerospace or into automotive, obviously there's the knock-on consequences of that. And perhaps we can go into that a little bit more in detail later on.
Yep. So I think, Rodney, if you could share with us, how does it harm you as a brand, as a Philip Morris? How does illicit trade directly and indirectly harm you?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I missed that, but I think I know where we're at. Look, maybe I'll just start, Azam, by mentioning, because I think it's an important point. Specifically, illicit trade in tobacco. It's a clear and let's say, direct funding source for terrorism, for organized crime. And cigarette smuggling provides quick capital for terrorist networks to grow from one illicit activity to others. So including, trading in arms, people, drugs, oil, antiquities, and other illicit products, which is obviously damaging government revenues, but also, like you mentioned, Hazam, the legitimate business. And I think very sadly too, and furthermore, it facilitates crimes in very local communities. It disrupts civil society and it fosters corruption. This smuggling of tobacco products, counterfeiting of tobacco products, and the tax evasion that's involved, results in government losses of somewhere between $40 and $50 billion a year. It's not small money. Legitimate businesses are clearly being undermined, and consumers are exposed to poorly made and unregulated products, particularly the counterfeit products. According to the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, the volume of international trade just in counterfeit and pirated goods alone is about $509 billion, which is about 3.3% of world trade. And again, counterfeiting is not just tobacco; it's medicines, cosmetics, toys, electronics. The list can go on. And if you look purely at comments from the Munich Security Conference, I mean, they tried to highlight that smuggling of arms, tobacco, and pharmaceuticals, just cross-border smuggling, can be somewhere between kind of 1.6 and 2.2 trillion US dollars a year. According to the World Health Organization and World Bank, illicit trade in tobacco is about 10 to 12% of the total global tobacco consumption. This is massive. This is about 600 billion illicit cigarettes, and Asia makes up about 20% of that. So it's kind of a big deal, Hazam.
Yep. All right. I think, Heath, if you could also highlight to us the scale of illicit trade in terms of food fraud.
Look, there are significant risks around counterfeit and replacement products within the food supply chain. There's some well-known figures when it comes to seafood product replacement. As I'm sitting in one of the world's biggest producers of wine, the scale of illegal wine, particularly in the Chinese market, has become very problematic for producers in the Australian environment. But we also see that going on in jurisdictions outside the Chinese market. We've had a number of brands trying to pursue within jurisdictions, cracking down on their copyright related issues. And of course, then we flow into the issues around the tobacco piece, which impacts both retail at street level, as well as the entire supply chain. The Australian market's now recording something like 20% of all tobacco sales as being illicit. I know in Malaysia that figure's up around 60%, and just by chance the biggest source of illicit product into the Australian market comes from Malaysia. So you can see where the cross-jurisdictional issues start to impact when you've got a large-scale illicit market occurring that can flow into other markets. I might leave it at that point.
Yep. All right. So I think one of the critical questions that should be answered in this webinar is, what are the drivers of illicit trade? I think, Rodney, you can go first on this one.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Hazam. Look, I'm not going to focus on cigarettes. I'm not saying it's not important, but I think there's a burning issue at the moment related specifically to what we refer to as the heated tobacco products, namely our product called IQOS, and the heat sticks that are part of that solution. The drivers there typically are awareness and public ignorance. So we need to build awareness on that. I think lack of policy and enforcement. Clearly at the moment, the economic climate and the price gaps that exist between countries, which is typically due to substantial differences in taxation rates from country to country. We also see illicit flows being a consequence of, let's say, flavour differences between countries. We don't have the same offer in every single country of the world. And the one that I want to focus on more, Hazam, is the issue of availability. And what I mean by that is, In some countries, the importation, the marketing and the sales of these heated tobacco products are not yet legitimized. And demand in many of these countries is increasing for this better alternative to cigarettes, and I call it IQOS. Our experience shows that if the illicit market size becomes overwhelming, it becomes almost, let's say, impossible to stop. And so legitimizing and appropriately regulating and taxing is definitely part of the solution. Now, you have countries like Malaysia and Vietnam who are seen at the moment as transit hubs for smuggling illicit tobacco products from parts of, say, Eastern Europe and Japan into China. In Asia, IQOS has been launched by Philip Morris, that is, in Japan, Korea, Malaysia, New Zealand, and the Philippines. However, there's still a growing demand in countries where PMI has not launched, such as in China, Taiwan, and Vietnam, and also a lot of growth demand in countries where these products are currently banned or de facto banned, such as in Singapore, Hong Kong, or even in Thailand. Now, even where PMI has launched, we also see products being smuggled in for other countries. For example, we've launched in Malaysia and Philippines, but we still see products from different parts of the world, usually Eastern Europe and Japan, coming into those two launch countries for the reasons that I mentioned before, which are typically price and flavour. Online sales are flourishing. PMI does a pretty good job of monitoring illicit sales of our products on the online platforms. And we take action against postings which clearly infringe our IP rights. We also share information with law enforcement in different countries for them to take appropriate action. And we also record our trademarks within customs in order to stop the inflow of counterfeit and contraband PMI products. Now, the products have been brought into the country typically by hand carry or by smuggling, causing significant tax losses for the government. And meanwhile, users are not protected on the quality and the safety of the products, right? As legal producers are facing the challenge, which has been talked about a couple of times, of counterfeit products in the markets. And this being one of the consequences that must be stopped. And as the saying goes, what you see, maybe not what you get. And that clearly applies to both the online and the offline channels, Azam.
That's true. All right, Tony, I think you could share with us a little bit on the consequences of illicit trade on the consumer and on the legitimate businesses.
Yeah, certainly. Look, but just following from what Rodney said, I think some of the issues are, and some of the drivers are, is that what we're not doing, we don't do this as a collaboration enough. You know, my experience is that with I'm not going to necessarily target the pharmaceutical or the electronics groups, because I've seen it across all of the sectors where there isn't enough collaboration across all of the organizations to actually solve the problem. And look, to Deborah's point earlier, you know, if you look at some of the drivers of this, you know, the financial gains are incredible. So if you think of the illicit trade, you know, linked together with modern slavery, together with corruption, because obviously most of these products can only move around, and as Rodney said, they can only go via these transit hubs if somebody is actually changing the paperwork and relabeling and things of that nature. So there's a lot of things that can be done. So in terms of the consumer, of course, the consumer is actually picking up the additional cost of this. But if you look at, as Rodney said, if you look at the lost revenue for the governments, it's colossal. So, you know, sometimes I do wonder why, you know, we as a global community can't actually get together and design this out, because we know there is technology there that would help us do that. We know that, for instance, something like the blockchain would create traceability of that paperwork down to the origin, and we know we're using the blockchain, it can't be altered without a red flag showing up. So, you know, I do feel that it can actually be designed out, which would actually, you know, stop these products getting through. And I do agree with Rodney, there's not enough awareness. You know, for instance, going back to what Heath said in terms of the bottles of wines in China. You know, if the legitimate bottles of wines, you know, contained a warning that, you know, if you're drinking counterfeit products. These are some of the damages that you're creating to the global community. Because generally, as we know, if you have a manufacturing plant producing counterfeit goods, normally the people working inside those plants can't go home. They can't leave because nobody wants that factory to be found. So there's a lot of modern slavery issues around that. And then it goes into the total supply chain. And that's where I think what we could be doing is underpinning that. Corporations could be underpinning that with standards, making sure things are audited, putting those checks and balances in to actually help design it out.
Yep. All right. So I think, Heath, if you could also add on a little bit in terms of the damages that can be caused on the social costs, especially for employment loss, and how this illicit trade can result in businesses shutting down.
Look, going down to retail level, there are clear impacts when you talk about 20% of your market disappearing to illegal trade, or up to 70% on some products. Unfortunately, there does tend to be an attitude amongst government of who cares about high-end fashion brands without understanding the economic impacts, whether it's the tax piece, the employment piece, the manufacturing piece, to their own economies, where you do tend to get more interest out of government and regulators. And it has been mentioned is the pieces around modern slavery, the risk to brands as well as governments, the risks around food safety. We've seen a number of instances where non-genuine food product has put people's health at risk. That can also occur in the alcohol as well as tobacco space. We did some testing recently of illicit tobacco in Australia and discovered there were chicken feathers mixed in with the tobacco, just as an example. We've also seen situations that's been mentioned where Big Pharma have found their products being falsified, and certainly there's been some PPE issues in relation to that. I might just follow up on the tracing and proof of product piece. I know there are a number of discussions happening within APEC and ASEAN around better traceability across border. And I know my friends at GS1 have been quite actively involved in looking at how we can start to get some of those cross-border standards effectively. But the social impacts of these products can be quite harmful to the economy, but also to individuals' health ultimately.
Yep, thanks, Heath. I think so. How is illicit goods transported into a country's border? So what kind of corruption, whether it's the multiple entry points, what are one of the main reasons that illicit goods are transported? I think Deborah, you can take this one.
Sure, I'll take a start at this. So there are a number of ways in which products come in. We have, in the past, done a lot of work, not us personally, but other people have done a lot of work, showing that free trade zones and other kinds of economic zone schemes often are, not always, but are often a contributing factor to the movement of illicit goods. So we have trade zones in different countries, different markets that are being formed all the time. Many of them are hotbeds for illicit trade of various kinds, maybe all kinds. So that's one key channel. And the reason why they are so problematic for illicit products is that the customs officials will say that what happens in the zone is not our responsibility. So, you do whatever you need to do in the zone, and as long as your products get exported from there, not our problem. And then other customs officials struggle with managing this because they may not be aware that it's coming from a free trade zone that's uninspected in the first place. So the zones themselves can be problematic. Now, that doesn't mean they have to be problematic. There's certainly ways to track cargo in and out of a free trade zone, either by road, rail, or air. it has to come in and out somehow, and customs could certainly do a better job of tracking the movement of goods in and out of the zone. But again, it's a bit of a balancing act. The more that you crack down on the movement of goods, the more you may also harm some legitimate trade, which takes place in free trade zones. Why do we have these zones? Well, governments like them because they can dictate where in their own country economic activity takes place. So many of these zones are placed in areas where job opportunities may be scarce, where they think that they can start to revitalize a particular geography, and so that's why we have them in the first place. And again, some measure, and it could be, depending on the zone, it may be entirely legitimate trade, or it may not be so entirely legitimate trade. So it's difficult to police these free trade zones in general. Then, of course, they come through various schemes with corrupt officials in different markets, particularly corrupt customs officials, fraud officials. There's a lot of money to be made by individuals who are in these border posts who can be paid off to allow illicit trade to flow, either, again, by road, rail, sea, air, etc. And so I think the real challenge is, how do you design an enforcement mechanism that allows legitimate trade through while stopping or reducing the incentives for illicit trade? It's difficult. It's tricky. Governments have struggled. Some governments have struggled. Some have struggled more than others because they care more about the consequences. Some have cared less, particularly, I would say, in some markets where the illicit goods are not intended for domestic consumers. Then it's much easier for governments to turn a blind eye because they say, well, this isn't going to impact my citizens. So if you want to, drink adulterated wine, if you want to put problematic parts on an automobile, we don't even drive automobiles here, we don't care. So, you do whatever you want to do, as long as I get paid off for doing it, that's fine with me. So I think that, again, that's part of why this tension continues to exist in around the world and around the region.
Yep. So I think also, Rodney, I would like to ask you, what's the role of transshipment and white cigarette in illicit trade? Because I think you are quite familiar with this one for tobacco industry, especially.
Yeah, sure. Look, I mean, I think getting real intelligence on this stuff, from our experience, takes resources, and it's substantial. And Philip Morris really commits to that. So we have a team of around about 100 plus illicit trade professionals globally. We've implemented technologically innovative, voluntary, let me say, tracking and tracing solutions, sophisticated security features, leading supply chain controls, and we'll talk about it later, we can't solve the problem without the support of others, others including everybody that's really participating in this call, including the public sector. To your point specifically, in a recent operation in China, and again, I'm going to focus purely today on heated tobacco products and our platform called IQOS. There was a total of 11 million heat sticks seized in the city of Ningbo. This is huge. According to the intelligence from the Chinese side, and we appreciate what they share with us, the illicit products were being airshipped out of Japan into Southeast Asian countries, including Vietnam, and smuggled by road into China. We've got other examples of where legal age users are buying through unauthorized online platforms. That can be social media, that can be marketplaces, that can be domains. The goods are then delivered via national postal services, express postal services, and sadly, when planes were flying more easily, the goods are also being transported through both commercial and cargo flights. Even in countries like Singapore, where it's even illegal at the moment to hand carry these products, but the demand is so high, and so users are taking every necessary action they need to make sure they can get access to these products. So what we really need to see is a strengthening of border controls, of law enforcement, as well as building appropriate regulations for novel tobacco products, including heated tobacco products, to protect the interests of the government, importantly in the area of tax losses due to illicit trade, but also adult smokers and legitimate producers. Collaboration, as was said before, with the private sector is an important part of the solution, as is cooperation with airlines, with airline associations, with postal services providers, to make sure that we can develop protocols to prevent this form of transportation. And lastly, now the recent investigations conducted by the authorities in China, these sorts of things should be celebrated. This should be amplified as best practices in many of the other countries I mentioned, in particular those who have not legitimized these products today.
Yep. I think, Tony, what best practices from a supply chain perspective can be done by the law enforcement agencies as well as the brands and to disturb the flow of these goods into a country?
So look, it goes back to what I said at the beginning, and some of the things that TAPA does, and also Roddy touched upon. But there needs to be more collaboration. So what TAPA has done has, we've been collaborating with law enforcement agencies across the world. We have very good relationships. We have good relationships with customs and other intelligence authorities. So, generally, where we have, for instance, incidents of cargo hijacking, we normally see that product is transported out of the country and then relabeled and then either sold on the grey or black market. So there are a number of things that we can do. Now, look, the reason why TAPA introduced standards, because standards actually provide some degree of auditing and control within your supply chain. And what it does, it helps to raise up any sort of red flags more easily, in the current process. But also, what it does is that with customs authorities, if you're a TAPA member and you've already gone through a large-scale certification program, already customs can see that you're a company that's trying to do its best to actually secure the supply chain. So that recognition is, that's something that we lobby the governments for. But also what we're trying to do is actually show or expose those organizations which are perhaps checking who the shipper is, from the source. And look, a couple of points there, on what Barbara was saying in terms of the free trade zones. Look, we need free trade zones, right? Free trade zones actually reduce shipping costs, where it allows us to do assembly and extra value-added services. What's happened is that the criminal organizations have realized that those free trade zones can be exploited, and they're taking the advantage, right? So in many respects, to Deborah's point, obviously they want to create employment, but this is the wrong type of employment that we're encouraging. Now, going back to what Rodney said in terms of intelligence, there's a lot of intelligence out there, but we're not sharing it. We're not actually putting it into a large-scale database, that can be used effectively. Look, and the reason why I say that, when I was in China in 2005, I won't say who the company was, but there were fake training shoes being produced. Now, over a period of time, basically, look, this is before we had big data. I contacted one of my guys in head office who was a business analyst, and he came down with this massive computer. I don't know how he actually got it in the X-ray machine, but he basically took all of that data into that laptop and basically did some reverse searching for me. So much so that we could actually predict where the shipments were actually coming from. Now, what we were able to do was wait until all of those shipments had been loaded, and we made a massive seizure in one night. Now, that must have been extremely painful for these organized gangs. So look, I think working with law enforcement is key, but the trouble is law enforcement have not got the resources, they haven't got the time. So this is where industry needs to go to them with the package, saying, right, here's the case for you. So, making sure we've got the evidence, everything they need, so that we can just give it to them, and then they can go and carry out the raids and also the prosecution with that. Because, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, whether you're in the UK, the US, Asia, Eastern Europe, all police forces have got the same problems in terms of lack of resources, and sometimes even the skill sets to investigate. This is where industry can actually do more to help them.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. I think Heath, what control measures that enforcement need to apply on parties that are involved in the illicit trade process? Either it's the shipper or the company that is actually importing this illicit good, or even the retailer who is selling the illicit tobacco or illicit product in a supermarket or in a retail shop?
Look, it does require a top-down approach from government as well as the cross-border and cross-jurisdictional piece. Talking to one of my colleagues, who's a former Australian federal police officer, he quite often cites UK Customs, Her Majesty's Customs, as being one of the best when it comes to the reality of that government has decided they have a social as well as an economic issue. There's specific ministers, government ministers, who are held responsible for making sure the relevant agencies are policing all the way through the supply chain, right down to retail level. And we all know with the UK, they've well, theoretically until quite recently had open borders. It's an approach that we've certainly been trying to encourage in other jurisdictions. It's also about having those agencies with some enforceable KPIs and realistic KPIs. It's fine to say, yes, you can. Your KPI is to seize one container of illegal alcohol per month. Well, how about your actual goal is to reduce the scale of illicit product in the marketplace by 50% or down to take it from, given the Malaysian example, from the current 60 down to a 5% level over the next 2-3 years. Some goals and individuals both within enforcement as well as government who are responsible in achieving those pieces. But that does require brands working together, brands highlighting these issues to government, and then having the various customs authorities and policing authorities across jurisdictions working together.
I think moving to free zones and how it's been misused and the impact on the economy, I think, Deborah, what is the purpose that free zones exist for, and is it actually fulfilling it?
So I think they vary. I mean, we have a lot of these free trade zones. Let me be clear, the free trade zone is different from a free trade agreement, which is a government-to-government agreement on how we manage cross-border trade in legal goods. Free trade zones exist within a country, and they have a variety of purposes, and many of them are necessary and legitimate. As an example, they allow firms to do assembly and to hold inventory closer to final markets. They have the legitimate purpose of encouraging employment in areas that may not otherwise have them. They are designed to facilitate trade in general. Many firms have very sophisticated operations, legal operations, in which free trade zones are a critical component of their overall manufacturing and processing, because they, among other things, they simplify the ability to import and export goods, and especially parts and components, to create finished products and then use the zones for, again, legitimate trade. The difficulty has been, in some markets, the enforcement of movement of goods in and out of these zones has not happened. So in some places, they become a magnet for all kinds of illicit activities, illicit manufacturing, counterfeit goods, financial problems. You have casinos in some of the free trade zones. I mean, there's all sorts of things that can happen in a free trade zone, in part because they are sort of they are viewed by some governments as an extraterritorial spot in your country where you argue, or many governments have argued, that is not my problem. That is someone else's problem, but it's not really mine. And here again, it's difficult. It's not that the zone idea is a bad one. It's that the zone itself, depending on the enthusiasm of the local government, regional government, and then the national government, how do they regulate and how do they enforce movement of goods and people and financial flows in and out of these zones? So it can be used in very important, legitimate ways for companies, for governments, can also be used for harm. And I think that's the challenge, again, is to try to not throw out all zones, because that would be problematic for firms and for governments as well, but to make sure that they are appropriately regulated with proper enforcement and make sure that the enforcement is not just sort of an arrest at the border, but then what do we do to prosecute a case all the way through to the end, that kind of thing.
So Hazem, if I can just jump in on what Deborah just said there. So look, you know, this is some of the things that TAP has been able to do in the past, right? You know, we've taken that sort of intelligence and look, rather than just go as one entity and, you know, make a complaint about it, we've gone as a whole organization saying that we represent, you know, this group of Fortune 500 companies who are all, you know, want to act in a corporate, social, responsible way. And look, you know, we've got this intelligence here that, you know, company ABC is performing these sort of illegal tasks, and we want you to address that issue. Now, look, if you go as a trade association, you're much stronger. And look, if I can just quickly give one example of that, is that you probably remember Heathrow Airport, you know, in the you know, around 2002 to 2003. You know, there were hijacks all the way around Heathrow Airport. And eventually, you know, I was part of the team that went to the police and the Department of Trade and Industry, and we lobbied for something to be done about it. And look, one major phone provider was actually looking at pulling out their distribution center from Heathrow and actually moving it across to another part of Europe, right, because of the impact. So, you know, when we sat down with the government, we showed them those figures on hijacking. You know, one, they couldn't believe it, and two, the police couldn't believe it either. And that's because each of the police local areas are all working in silos. And that's the danger that we've got now on a global scale. Everyone's working in their own silo. So we haven't got the sharing of information. No one's really looking at their overall picture. If you look at everyone's goals or objectives, they're all focused on their own local areas, their own areas of responsibility. As it's already been said by Deborah, if it's happening, hey, it's not their problem. And so that's where we need that sort of collaboration to try and bring this together. And look, going back to what I'm saying, lobbying as an organization is much stronger than lobbying as an individual.
Yep. Thanks, Tony. I think Rodney, for tobacco, what particular issues the Philip Morris has faced with free trade zones?
Look, firstly, and not to sound like a broken record, I want to again echo the comments of Deborah and Tony. I say that to say this. Free trade zones are vital to legitimate companies that have a global or regional footprint because it optimizes everything related to supply chain. Now, unfortunately today, there's no, let's say, recognized code of conduct for how free trade zones should operate. And there's no independent assessor to measure the performance of each zone, understand the level of corruption and negligence or lack of transparency that might exist. And I'm not sure how much of the worldwide illicit trade in tobacco goes through free zones, but free zones are clearly playing a role in enabling the flows. Now, I understand the OECD has been promoting quite recently a code of conduct for free trade zones. And again, if I understand correctly, they're building a toolbox. They're building a toolbox of information which they can offer as part of that code of conduct. Now, also you have the World Free Zone Organization, which has made massive strides, and I don't think that's an exaggeration. Firstly, by piloting its what they call safe zone initiative within 5 free trade zones. And they're now at the point where they're taking that to a much broader reach. And I think cooperation between these two organizations, but also similar organizations, is key to preventing the misuse of free zones, so at least legal operators can continue to take advantage of the opportunities that they provide. Now, the conversation on this is vital, and where legally allowed, PMI, we share intelligence with law enforcement and customs. We've had quite some success, I would say, in directing efforts to targeted shipments where there is some sort of suspicion of illicit goods. We offer capability building programs to assist officers in determining whether goods detained are intended for their market or not. and in making an initial assessment on also the authenticity of the products. And when all cases we can, we even send our own forensic experts in to take a final decision on the authenticity. And then if these products are seen to be our products, we have a process called a seizure follow-up, where we're required to reverse engineer the entire supply chain to at least understand within our supply chain, where did the potential diversion take place. So that's my comments in relation to free zones and customs ports in particular. So thanks, Hazan.
Thanks, Rodney. I think in terms of regulations, what kind of regulations should be imposed on free trade zones to ensure that the illicit goods are not going anywhere into the border?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that, Hazan.
What kind of regulations should be imposed on free trade zones to ensure that the flow of illicit trade is disturbed?
Yeah, sorry, you're cutting in and out quite badly. It might be my bandwidth. Just.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Just give me a sec. I'm just going to jump onto another network.
I think he's having a network connection. Okay, I think, Tony, you could take this question until he comes back.
Can you just remind me what the question was? I was concentrating on these.
What kind of regulations should be imposed on free trade zones?
Regulations?
Yeah.
I don't think we should over-regulate, because when you over-regulate, then there's no stopping. Okay, and look, if you try to over-regulate, then you get into sort of trade war discussions, right? So, look, this should be about the community policing itself, right? We're all trying to achieve a common goal here. So again, I think what it should be doing, we should be going as trade associations to the, the respective government departments and lobbying for change. And look, I wasn't aware, and thank you for Rodney for stating that. I wasn't aware that OECD had actually developed, like some standard for the free trade zones, right? So, that needs to be rolled out. That needs to be helped. So for instance, all of us need to get together and see how we can help the legitimate members operating inside these free trade zones to actually raise the bar and expose those who are not. So as it goes on to what I was saying about people smuggling. People smuggling could really be designed out, from being smuggled in containers and trucks. If we all got together as a community and put together in the simple, basic process of a truck security requirement, which means that all your drivers are trained, you have a GPS tracking on the vehicle. GPS tracking is very cheap nowadays. It's affordable. In actual fact, most trucks actually have it on it. So if someone's not actually putting GPS on their truck, then you've got to be asking yourself why, okay? And then let's go back to the free trade zones. If no one's, if we have got a group of companies who don't want to adopt that standard, who don't want to have internal auditors coming in and checking, then we've got to ask the question, what are they actually doing in the zone? And by that self-policing, right, we can drive these, these criminal gangs out because they will be exposed. And look, going back to what Rodney said, I think sometimes company lawyers create a problem for us, because company lawyers will quite easily turn around and say no when the question comes on sharing of information. And for me, it's total lack of strength in going forward and saying, no, there are reasonable grounds here to share that information for the prevention and detection of crime. And of course, the illicit trade, as Deborah said, most of it is actually illegal. So if it's illegal, we can actually share information lawfully. And don't forget, we're not necessarily always sharing personal data. What we're sharing is generally shipment data or a company information. So the point is, there's so much that we can do as a community to actually impact this. And what I get a bit frustrated sometimes where I see us all approaching it from different angles, and we're not joining our forces and actually going into the government agencies and getting the matter addressed. And look, let me just go back to one example of lobbying. Look, when some of our members were being hijacked in Malaysia, you know, I went and sat down with the Department of Trade and Industry there, and hey, they set up a meeting for me. The next thing, I had 67 stakeholders in a room, and I presented to those 67 stakeholders. Now, you know, the Malaysian government realized what the issue was, and they realized that manufacturing companies would end up moving out of Malaysia because there's no point manufacturing products if you're going to get hijacked, because now your product's gone into a different market, into the grey market. You've got the loss of sale and all of the other issues that Heath mentioned. So straight away, they realized something had to be done. And we had the Deputy Chief of Police, not just a senior police officer, deputy head of Chief of the Police. We had the Deputy Head of Customs. We had the East and the West Corps come in. So we had all of these strong stakeholders at the table who were all listening to what our members were saying. We cannot be hijacked any longer. We can't keep having our products stolen. And if you look at the impact of that, the actual number of hijacks that have occurred in Malaysia have actually reduced dramatically. And that's the sort of action that we need. So, you know, I do believe that, you know, collectively, if we all got together, we can actually go to, you know, the respective governments and say, here is the evidence, you know, here are some of the issues, you need to clamp down on this. And at the same time, we need to go to the zones and say to the zones, hey guys, you know, the zone owners, you know, you need to address this issue. You need to be part of this discussion. There's no, you can't, you know, hide behind privacy or data, etc. You know, this is a social, a global social responsibility problem.
All right, thanks, Tony. I think we are almost, so just to critical factors in combating illicit trade activities. So what kind of strategy and coordination from your perspective, Rodney, could be taken forward to combat illicit trade?
Sorry, who's the question for? I missed.
Rodney, it's for you.
And I don't understand exactly the question. If you can reframe. Yep.
What measures for strategy and coordination can be taken forward in the future to ensure the disturbance of illicit trade?
Look, I think it's already been said, so to avoid kind of sounding like a broken record. We are big, Philip Morris, as a company of promoting cooperation between public and private sector. And this is absolutely essential. Without that, it's not going to be fixed. You know, PMI, when we're tackling illicit trade, we tend to look beyond illicit trade in tobacco, and I think that's absolutely essential as well, because the illicit trade of one product is actually fueling the illicit trade of others, if you know what I mean. And that's why in 2016, PMI decided to launch PMI Impact. It's a global initiative supporting public, private, and NGO projects aimed at tackling illicit trade and related crimes broadly, such as corruption, money laundering, and organized crime. And it's an initiative that we took really seriously. I mean, PMI allocated $100 million to this. And we're currently in the second of three funding rounds. The third funding round should be announced later in 2020, providing things return to somewhat normal situations. You know, in today's hyper-connected world, I think with growing concerns around global security, the proliferation of criminal organizations and the surge, particularly now of new digital tools, you know, it's more important than ever for NGOs, law enforcement agencies, governments, academics, and other sectors of civil society to continue coming together, even if it's via a virtual platform like this. You could even argue that this is even more effective than the way it used to be in the past. But again, it's to make sure that we're sharing ideas around a common goal. We're trying to define solutions around a common goal. And that common goal is to fight against illicit trade and its related crimes. So I know that's not a direct answer to your question, but I think it's useful in the context of the question. We have to do this. We have to do this together, Hazan.
Yeah, thanks, Rodney. I think we've been receiving quite a lot of questions from the audience, and mostly are directed to you, Rodney. So I think we could start with the first question that we've received. So, Rodney, you said that there is no silver bullet and that a solution can only be achieved through broad collaboration between the private and public sector. I think there's another part. So, with that in mind, what kind of global treaties or frameworks do you see useful in tackling the issue in tobacco today?
That question is so pertinent, and to the person, the organisation, the association that raised that question, I appreciate the fact that you asked it. There's a really important treaty. The World Health Organization, the WHO, Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, the FCTC. It's called the Protocol to Eliminate Illicit Trade in Tobacco Products. We refer to it simply as the Protocol on Illicit Trade. It's a milestone in tackling the global issue of illegal tobacco, and it entered into force a couple of years ago. PMI supports the objective, and we actually encourage other countries to ratify, because as of today, we still see only around 60 countries worldwide who are part of this treaty, which we believe strongly is insufficient to address the issue. In fact, you could actually say that limited participation might move the issue from one country to another. So one country that might be putting in place all the regulation associated with what the protocol instructs may mean that they become better at addressing illicit trade, but it could just move the problem to countries who haven't ratified and therefore haven't put in place the necessary policies, procedures, and transparency mechanisms. The protocol has many vital elements. Maybe one that I'll talk about would be one that refers to regulation around tracking and tracing, which for those who are not aware, quite simply, it's the ability to record the forward movement of products and also trace backwards their history, right, along the supply chain. Now, PMI has long supported the implementation of a global tracking and tracing regime. With a global tracking and tracing regime, all manufacturers will need to be held to the same standards in securing their supply chains. And we believe that an effective global tracking and tracing system has to be independent, it has to be interoperable, based on internationally recognized open standards. And we, for very obvious reasons, favor a digital solution because it really enables interoperability, but also promotes innovation. I mean, let's be honest, the future is in digital. And when you promote innovation, you also have better opportunities to optimize enforcement activities, which with governments need to play out, keeping in mind they have limited resources. So we support independent, cost-effective solutions that don't disrupt the manufacturing and distribution environment, allowing manufacturers like ourselves to perform daily operations and implement such solutions in their factories across the supply chain. So the WHO has a great treaty here in place. We support many more countries to ratify this treaty and participate in adopting regulation, which is, again, not a silver bullet, but it's certainly going to go a long way in addressing this problem, Hassan.
Yep. Thanks, Rodney. I think we have one more question for Heath. How are counterfeiters exploiting the pandemic to self-distribute fake goods? I think referring to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yes. Look, I suppose the first thing that comes to mind is the PPE issue. And interestingly enough, what I got from Rodney's comments, have been doing a bit of work in the Australian environment with GS1 around traceability of PPE products coming into the market, so we can ensure that they are genuine. That's probably been the lead and obvious piece that's been occurring. What we are starting to hear of is as individual incomes are being crunched and consumers are looking for cheaper products, there does appear to be a spike in the search for a number of illicit products, both going into the medical area, but also in that alcohol and tobacco space. I think the reality is we know that there's going to be a significant economic impact on individuals moving forward, and they will, for price-sensitive issues, be looking to source non-genuine products. And not considering the risks to their own health or the people around them.
Yep. Thanks. I think one more question for Deborah. With the current COVID-19, how do you see the future for legitimate trade and illicit trade?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think there are a couple of challenges ahead in the cracking down on illicit trade, and one of them is the amount of cash that has been expended to fight the pandemic. It leaves governments with less revenue than they had in the past because they've spent a lot of money on government support or because they have had cutbacks in their tax base and so forth. So I think government revenues to support a crackdown in illicit trade may be less in the immediate COVID period and the immediate COVID aftermath. So that's a challenge for illicit trade. There's also a challenge for brands, some of whom may feel like they need to cut corners in one way or another, and also by consumers who are also feeling cash strapped, who may be driven to buy counterfeit products which are viewed as cheaper, and maybe in some instances less dangerous, in some instances they may not know, but they're going to be much more price sensitive. So I think that the real challenge around COVID to me is in a time of economic contraction and downturn, the incentives for many of the key players in combating illicit trade may be skewed in the wrong direction. So we may find more illicit trade in this time frame and in the immediate aftermath than we found beforehand, just because resources are strapped by governments, because brands are potentially cutting corners to survive, and because consumers are desperate for a bargain. You may find a whole lot more illicit trade coming out of this than you did before. I mean, I would really hope not. On behalf of all of those things, governments, brands, consumers, we prefer to have less illicit trade, clearly, and more legitimate trade. But I just think the incentives are a bit of a problem right now, and so we'll have to see where this goes. But the signs in the near term are not that promising, I'm afraid.
Yep. Thanks, Deborah. I think one more question for Tony. What are the best practices that can strengthen the supply chain of a product?
So look, I would again go back and push standards. Okay, so although I'm representing TAPA today, I've also used the ISO standards to do so. So there are some great ISO standards out there. So you have the ISO 28000, which is the security management system for the supply chain. You have ISO 31000, which is the risk management process. And look, just by using those two alone, you can actually really improve your whole supply chain. Now, let's just think of some of the comments made by Rodney and Deborah alone. Look, we know that the governments haven't got the funds, right, to help us going forward. As Deborah alluded to, governments have spent so much money on basically trying to hold up employment and support the global community. Once the pandemic dies off and the vaccine's rolled out, hey, everyone's going to be cash strapped. So, when we talk about digitalization, as Rodney mentioned, are companies going to be able to have that money readily available to do digitalization? I'm not sure if they are. I do personally believe, having done a digital transformation project myself, which took me 2.5 years, I do believe that you can still do it without having massive investment. I managed to do it on a budget of 60,000 USD. So look, if there's a will, there's a way to actually to do that. And also, look, if we map our digital process together with our actual process, to all of the speakers' points, we can start doing is creating that traceability. And look, if you use standards to underpin everything you're doing, what it means is that you've got a check and balance in place. That somebody is actually going there and auditing that to make sure that you are compliant. And look, I think there was years ago there was a sort of people worried about standards just for standards' sake, and certainly from TAPA's point of view, I just want to point out, we do not allow any weakening of our standards. If we do, we do punish the audit companies and actually punish the auditors involved. So we're very, very strict in that process. We will not allow our standard to be weakened in any way. And if everyone does that, that means that we're going to raise the bar in the community. It means that by implementing a standard is actually going to drive change in the supply chain. And as I mentioned earlier, look, it will help expose those organizations who are not coming up to that level. And then, you've got to ask yourself why. So why would you be using companies that are not coming up to that level? And look, in one case study, just before I finish, in one case study, when I did, similar to what Rodney was saying, in terms of reverse engineering for the supply chain, all of the forwarders involved, had no standards. They didn't have an ISO standard. They had nothing to do with in terms of AO or STP compliance or CTPAT compliance. So, you can start to group those companies as the ones who are going to get involved in this, because they can't compete with the bigger companies, so they end up working in those sort of, I would say, those dark areas of the supply chain to actually get their business. So driving standards, drives that professionalism throughout the supply chain.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. I think we have the time for one last question for Rodney. I think.
Can I make a comment, Hazam, rather than?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Look, I just think it's important, because one thing we haven't talked a lot about today, but I appreciate that Deborah was leading in that direction, is COVID itself is creating problems, and post-COVID, that financial crisis and the expected, let's say, reduction in disposable income is going to drive down trading, and when you drive down trading, you're enabling illicit trade. So I just want to give one very clear example of something that we need to learn from. So in March, specifically in Malaysia, the Malaysian government imposed a nationwide movement control order. It was called the MCO, to curb the spread of COVID-19, which is a very sensible decision. Unfortunately, as a result, legitimate tobacco players weren't able to supply legitimate tobacco products.
Yep.
And no surprise, when the legal industry can't supply, the illicit industry takes over. Now, in Malaysia, the illicit consumption is already round about, like Keith was saying before, between 60 and 65% of total consumption. When the legal industry wasn't able to supply, technically, the illicit industry overnight became 100% of total consumption, which is just outrageous. Now, again, if you think about all the indicators that are taking place in Malaysia at the moment, disposable income is going to be an absolute problem moving forward. Now, in saying all that, though, we're extremely grateful, because in May, the government decided that the legal industry could start to resume selling products again. So I think what we're hoping for now in learning from this is a strengthening in Malaysia and other similar countries of enforcement efforts to curb the expected growth of illicit trade in tobacco products, both online and offline, particularly online, where the sale of tobacco products is currently illegal. And for, I would say, the years 2021 to 2022, keeping in mind the economic expectations, for the government to possibly grant a moratorium on tobacco excise taxes to avoid this acceleration of downtrading, which it's going to happen as a result of, again, the lack of disposable income and the poorer than normal economic situation. So I just wanted to leave it with that comment. COVID's been tough, but I would argue in many economies of the world, the future beyond COVID is going to get even tougher.
Yep, thanks, Rodney. I think there is one more question directed to you, which says that BMI looks beyond tobacco in addressing the illicit trade. So is there anything in particular that BMI does to foster this belief?
Yeah, again, I mean, the only thing I can bridge back to, Hazam, and maybe I wasn't so clear before, so I apologise if I wasn't clear. I'd focus then again on PMI impact, right? We have $100 million which we've contributed to projects to support public sector, private sector, and NGOs. I'd like to even further promote that now with startups. We bring a very different thinking to find solutions around the broader issues. I'm talking tobacco, the broader issues around illicit trade. So for anybody out there who's interested in participating in the third funding round, you can go to pmiimpact.com, find out more about the initiative. And when the third funding is announced, I would seriously encourage you to try and put forward a project which you think is unique in addressing this issue, this global phenomenon of illicit trade.
Yep. I think we have one more question from Matthew. Just a second, let me show it. It's a quite good question that we can finalize with from Philippines Customs. What should be future steps from each speaker's perspective to be taken by the government and private sector to disrupt illicit trade? I think we could start from you, Heath.
Thank you. And yes, we actually had an opportunity a couple of years back to address some of these issues with Philippines Customs and a number of government agencies. Look, it's much the same scenario as we've had with the Malaysian conversation piece, where we see a jurisdiction like Singapore taking both a very on-the-ground educational piece to a jurisdiction like the UK, where senior officials within government take responsibility for revenue concerns, health concerns, etc. You need to work as a group of brand owners, as a group of industry groups, to activate that government to start to implement from the top down to address issues that we might see around corruption, around leakage, but getting some of those KPIs in place around what we tried to achieve here around actual illicit trade numbers, whether it's on alcohol, tobacco, drugs, medicines, etc. What is the reduced market? How are you going to get to that point? And who's going to take responsibility through that process?
Thank you. I think, Deborah, if you have anything on this question.
I would say, if I were talking to Philippine Customs, this should not just be your problem. So I think what we need to do is set up a structure internally that includes multiple agencies regularly meeting together with the private sector present to have conversations about what have we done recently and what have you done recently to combat this set of problems, and maybe break it down by sector, by industry, just to get started. But to encourage this multi-stakeholder and, crucially for government, multi-agency approach, I think is critical, because it can't just be a customs issue. It can't just be a law enforcement issue internally in government. It has to involve different kinds of agencies and ministries coming together. And it needs to be driven, especially in a country like the Philippines and other Asian economies, by the top. So if you have buy-in from the top of various agencies and ministries to support this interagency process, I think you might find that you'll get further. So I think that needs to be a part of the agenda, and there needs to be regularly scheduled check-ins that make a big difference.
All right. I think, Rodney, do you have anything to add on this question?
Sure. I'm just going to focus again on Malaysia and be very brief. So as I said, in recent times, illicit trade became almost 100% of the market. Credit, though, to Malaysian Customs. I know there's a new head of the Royal Malaysian Customs, so a shout out to you, because I think you've done a tremendous job, particularly in the last few months, in increasing the amount of seizures that have taken place on tobacco products that have been attempted to be smuggled into Malaysia. We haven't seen the numbers before that we've seen in the last 3 months. It's been a real step up. Although there's still some challenges, though, because I believe there was some intelligence shared very recently with regards to some potential goods in transit of these heated tobacco products that I refer to, that I understand will be stopping over in Malaysia and then heading to a place which I think is Vietnam. Now, sometimes regulation doesn't allow for these sorts of seizures, and I respect that. But again, I would welcome the opportunity to have greater conversations with the likes of Customs to see, even in cases where it may be not legal to seize, to see what cooperation can exist and what solutions we can find by working together, keeping in mind that, as I said, sometimes regulation doesn't allow the seizure. Even though we strongly believe these are our products, they should be seized. So cooperation is going to be absolutely vital.
Yep. How about you, Tony, if you have any add-ons on this question?
Yeah, certainly. So look, President Duterte, you may remember, introduced the whistleblower hotline. And look, our members reported that there was actually a reduction in customs, officers involved in kickbacks, because it allowed other officers to actually report those occasions, and obviously the ramifications of that, the investigations were taking place straight away. Officers were suspended and even dismissed. So look, I think that was a great step forward. I think what Philippines Customs could do is learn the lessons from Thailand. So for over 10 years now, Thailand have been allowed to have overtime payments, okay? So as we know, historically, overtime payments were going to the officers' pockets. In Thailand, that goes through a documented process where you actually pay the money into the Customs Bureau, and then the officer is actually paid overtime. So look, I would like to see that customs officers were paid correctly, for their profession. So I would like to see that become a profession, so they actually become more of advisors rather than just enforcement. But by raising their level of salary, what it would do, it will make them treasure the role much better, and hopefully deter that temptation of taking money. Look, when people are poorly paid and they can reap the benefits of fraud or corruption, then look, it's easy to persuade people to do that if people are not paid correctly. So by allowing them to do overtime, allowing as Rodney said earlier, hey, we want free trade, right? We want fast movement. We don't want inventory tied up at the borders. So we want the goods to go through. So rather than pay people, which creates that whole cycle of corruption. If there's a structured overtime payment process, and then the officer is paid for that overtime, then it's all done in a legitimate way. So there's two control measures there alone that will actually help. Okay, and of course, look, in terms of the customs training, it's not just about the loss of revenue to the governments. When you talk about loss of revenue to the government, to the general public, I don't think people really care. To the extent that we want them to. But when you start talking about modern slavery and the impact on corruption in society, then I think people start to realize, hey, this is a bigger problem, right? And this is where we become socially responsible, and then we start to do the right thing. So I think there's a number of things that we can be done on the education side. And look, in working with organizations like TAPA, we will actually help and train customs officers free of charge on how to audit the processes, how to put those additional control measures in place. We actually do that with Singapore Customs, and we've worked with customs agencies all across the region to actually improve in that area.
Just 20 seconds, Azam. I've got to build on what Tony said, specifically with regards to Philippines. I don't know if there's anybody from the Philippines on the call, but I know you made comparison to Thailand, but for me, Philippines at the moment, best in class. So a shout out to Bureau of Customs Philippines, where particularly in the last 6 months, the cooperation that we've personally had with them has been absolutely appreciated. It's brought big benefit to the legal industry, and I think big benefit to the Ministry of Finance in Philippines. A massive increase in the number of seized containers. There was, I think, 5 40-footers contained just in the recent weeks, which is huge. And if you look at the total work year to date from the Bureau of Customs, the total number of seizures as of June exceeded the full year of 2019. And I think a lot of this has to do with what I call best in class, which is the formation of a specific illicit trade tobacco task force. So if anybody's on the call from the Philippines, shout out to you. And for any other bureaus of customs around the world, I would strongly encourage you to refer to what's happening in the Philippines with regards to the task force. So thank you to the Philippines if you're on the call.
Indeed, thank you, Rodney. I think we have covered majority of the questions we have received, and also we are almost, our time is almost up. So I would like to thank all the speakers for their contribution today, and definitely thank the organizations for regularly fighting illicit trade and ensuring a safe society for everyone. Thank you, Heath, Michael. Thank you, Rodney. Thank you, Deborah, and thank you, Log, for joining us today. We definitely look forward to hosting everyone again in our ASEC 3.0 series, Fighting the Fakes, a step-by-step guide on building an effective brand protection strategy. So thank you again for joining us today.
Thanks, everybody. Much appreciated. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.